7 terrifying Reddit stories from the woods. There's something about the woods. They're supposed to be where you go to get away from it all, to find some peace and quiet. But the truth is, sometimes you're not as alone out there as you think. We went digging through the dark corners of Reddit to find stories from people who walked into the woods and came back with a tale they just had to tell. These are their stories about strange disappearances, encounters that just don't make sense, and the chilling feeling that some things in this world are better left alone. After hearing these, you just might think twice before your next hike. Story 1. The Devil's Tramping Ground. My friends and I were always suckers for a good local legend, and around here, nothing was more famous than the Devil's Tramping Ground. The story goes, it's a perfect circle of dead earth out in the North Carolina woods, where absolutely nothing will grow. They say it's where the devil himself paces every night, thinking up his evil plans. When we finally got there, it was underwhelming. The circle was definitely real. You could see it right from the road. 40-foot ring of dead dirt surrounded by perfectly healthy forest. But it was also covered in empty beer cans and the mess from a bonfire. Someone had even spray painted, "The devil lives here," on the pavement nearby. It felt more like a local party spot than a gateway to hell. We decided to stick around anyway, joking that we wanted front row seats for Lucifer's primetime appearance. After a while, a couple of my friends got cold and went back to the car, but me and my buddy, Mark, stayed put. I even had a Ziploc bag with me to get a soil sample, mostly as a joke. As the hours went on, the woods got silent. And I don't mean quiet, I mean silent. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind stopped blowing. There was just nothing. That's when we heard it. A heavy footstep deep in the trees. Not an animal. This was two-legged, and whatever it wasn't trying to be quiet. Then another step, closer. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, and I could just see a shape moving between the trees. It was tall and shaped like a person, but its proportions were all wrong. As it got closer, this smell hit us a nasty, chemical stink of sulfur and rot. We were completely frozen, not even breathing. It would walk, then stop, then walk again, closing the distance every time. We just stared, locked in place by a kind of primal fear I have never felt before or since. It seems like some things you find in the woods are ancient and angry, and some are things that just shouldn't be there at all. Story 2. The Abandoned Church. My friends and I were camping deep in a state forest, miles away from any real campsite. On our second night, as we were sitting around the fire, we heard something. It was faint at first, but it was definitely singing. It sounded like an old church hymn, but warped, like it was being carried on the wind from far away. We remembered seeing an abandoned chapel on an old map, about a half-mile deeper into the woods, but we just figured it was a pile of ruins. Well, our curiosity won. We grabbed our flashlights and started walking towards the music. The closer we got, the louder the singing became. It was coming from the church, no question. The building was barely standing, with a collapsed roof open to the night sky. We crept to the edge of the clearing and hid behind a big, fallen log to watch. Then, the singing just stopped. The heavy wooden doors of the church creaked open, and a line of people started walking out. There were maybe a dozen of them, all in simple, dark clothes, holding hands. A few carried old-timey lanterns that threw these long, dancing shadows everywhere. Their faces were just blank, no emotion at all. They moved together, perfectly in sync, walking out of the church and disappearing into the trees on the other side of the clearing. We had no idea if we'd stumbled onto a cult meeting or something much, much worse. But when the last person in line stopped and slowly turned their head right in our direction, we didn't stick around to find out. We scrambled back the way we came, not even daring to look back, the only sound being our own panicked footsteps on the forest floor. Sometimes the threat isn't a group of strangers in the dark, but the one person you thought you knew best. The human mind is its own kind of wilderness, and it can be a terrifying place to get lost. If these stories are hitting home, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss our next trip into the unknown. Now, let's get back to the woods. Story 3. The unraveling. I've been camping with my best friend Alex since we were kids. I thought we knew everything about each other, our habits, our fears. I was wrong. We were on a 3-day trip, deep in a remote part of the Rockies, just us two. The first night was totally normal. We made dinner, told some stories, everything was great. The second day, something changed. Alex got really quiet, withdrawn. He'd just stare off into the woods for minutes at a time, not answering when I talked to him. I figured he was just tired. That night, I woke up to him muttering something just outside the tent. I called his name, and he immediately went quiet. I looked outside, and he was just standing there with his back to me. I asked him if he was okay. He turned around, and his face, it was just wrong. His eyes were wide, and he had this grin that was all teeth. He started walking toward me, really slowly, and then he just lunged. I've never seen him move that fast. He tackled me, screaming these sounds that weren't even words, just pure rage. I kicked him off me and just ran blindly into the dark forest. He chased me. For what felt like an hour, I was being hunted by my own best friend. I finally lost him and hid until sunrise, then made the long, terrifying hike back to the car by myself. I had to report him missing. The police searched for weeks, but found nothing. Then, 6 months later, he just shows up in a town 100 miles away. He had no memory of the trip, or of the last 6 months of his life. He's Alex again now, but there's something missing from his eyes. And I'll never, ever know what really happened to him out there, or what it was that was chasing me through the woods that night. A person you can't explain is terrifying, but so is a presence you can feel, but can't see. Story 4. Hunted. I'm a pretty avid hiker. I love the solitude, the challenge of it. But one trip completely changed how I feel about the woods. I was on a trail I'd hiked a dozen times, a path I knew like the back of my hand. About 2 miles in, I got that feeling. You know the one. That prickle on the back of your neck. It just screams you're being watched. I stopped and looked around the trees. I saw nothing. I told myself it was probably just a deer and kept going, but the feeling just got stronger. It felt like a pair of eyes were burning a hole in my back. Every few hundred feet, I'd hear a twig snapping just off the trail, a rustle of leaves that wasn't from the wind. But every time I stopped to listen, it would go completely silent. I started walking faster. The paranoia was turning into real fear. I started seeing things in my peripheral vision. A dark shape, darting between trees, always gone by the time I turned to look. Was it an animal? A person? Was I just losing my mind? It didn't matter. The feeling of being prey was real. I made a conscious choice not to run. I was scared of what might happen if I let it know that I knew. So I just walked, faster and faster, my heart pounding in my chest. Those 2 miles back to the trailhead felt like 100. When I finally broke through the trees and saw my car, I sprinted, jumped in, and slammed the locks. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and for just a split second, I swear I saw a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the woods, just watching me go. Some things that follow you in the woods are flesh and blood. Others are a lot harder to explain. Story 5. The Glimmer Man. My house backs right up against a huge, undeveloped patch of forest. Most nights, it's completely peaceful, but for the last few months, I've been seeing something out there. I started calling it the Glimmer Man. The first time, I was looking out my kitchen window late at night. I saw this strange distortion in the air by the tree line. You know, like the heat haze you see on a hot road. But it was a cool night. As I watched, this shimmer started to pull together into the shape of a man. It wasn't solid, though. It was like it was made of that predator camouflage, blending in so perfectly with the woods behind it that it was almost invisible, but you could still tell it was there. It just stood there for a minute, and then it dissolved. It didn't walk away. It just shimmered and faded into nothing. I was sure I was losing it, but then I saw it again a week later, and this time it was closer to my house. I've seen it maybe 5 or 6 times now. It never does anything. It just shows up, stands perfectly still, and then vanishes. I started digging around online, looking at local folklore and old forums. Turns out, people in my area have been reporting this thing for years, often alongside other weird stuff like strange lights in the sky or odd sounds. And they all call it the same thing, the Glimmer Man. Nobody knows what it is? A ghost? An alien? Something from another dimension? I have no idea. All I know is that every night I catch myself staring out my window, half hoping and half dreading that I'll see it again. The fear of something watching you from the woods is one thing. The fear of it trying to get into your house is something else entirely. Story 6. The watcher my wife and I bought our dream home. It was this beautiful old house on a quiet cul-de-sac that ended right at a thick, dark forest. It felt private. It felt safe. For the first month, it was perfect. And then the letters started showing up. The first one was in our mailbox. Plain white envelope. No stamp. Our address typed out. Inside, a single piece of paper just said, "The woods have been watching you. I have been watching you." We figured it was a dumb prank by some local kids and threw it out. A week later, another one arrived. "You have such lovely children. They look like the fresh blood the house has been waiting for." That's when we called the police. They took a report, but told us there wasn't much they could do. The letters didn't stop. Each one got more specific, more personal. They described what my wife and I were wearing, what we'd had for dinner, things we'd said inside our own house. The writer called themselves The Watcher and claimed their family had been guarding our house for generations, waiting for its second coming. They made it very clear that the woods were their territory. We installed cameras, a full security system, floodlights. We never caught a single person, but sometimes when we'd review the footage from the camera pointing at the woods, we'd see it, the faintest shadow moving just out of the light's reach, or a pair of eyes reflecting the infrared for just a second before disappearing. We sold that house at a huge loss just 6 months after we moved in. We never found out who the watcher was, but I'm certain they're still out there, watching from the trees. Sometimes the danger doesn't just watch from a distance. It calls to you. Story 7. Voices in the Night. For my 30th birthday, I decided to go on a solo camping trip. Just me, my tent, and the wild. I found this perfect spot next to a creek, miles down an old dirt service road. When night fell, the forest was full of the normal sounds of crickets and frogs. I fell asleep feeling totally at peace. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a voice whispering my name. It sounded like a woman, and she was right outside my tent. I froze. My blood ran cold. I was miles from another living soul. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I just listened. "David?" the voice whispered again, closer this time. "Come out. We need your help. Someone is hurt." It sounded so real, so desperate, but every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was a trap. I slowly reached for the heavy maglite I kept next to my sleeping bag. Then, a second voice, a man's, joined in. "Please," he said, his voice begging. "We saw your fire. We're lost." They never sounded angry, only helpless. And that's what made it so terrifying. They were trying to lure me outside. I stayed completely still, didn't make a sound. For almost an hour, they just circled my tent, whispering and pleading, sometimes even crying softly. I could hear their footsteps on the dry leaves, sometimes one person, sometimes two. Then, as suddenly as it all started, it just stopped. The woods went back to the normal sounds of insects. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. At the first sign of light, I packed up my gear faster than I ever have in my life and practically ran back to my car. I have no idea who or what was out there that night, but I know with absolute certainty that if I had unzipped that tent, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. Conclusion: the forest keeps its secrets. These stories, pulled from that digital campfire we call Reddit, are a good reminder that the line between our world and something much older and wilder is probably thinner than we think. What we hear in the rustling leaves, or see in the shadows between the trees. It might be more than just our imagination. It might be the woods themselves, watching us back. What have you run into out in the wilderness? Share your own stories in the comments below. And if you want to hear more tales that make you question the world around you, be sure to subscribe and ring that bell. Stay safe out there, and whatever you do, try not to wander too far from the trail. True Reddit horror stories that are actually real. Reddit is an endless library of stories, but some of them feel a little too real to be fiction. We've been digging through some of the darkest corners of the site, places like r Let's Not Meet and r True Scare Stories, looking for those tales that posters swear are 100% true. No, we can't fact-check an anonymous story from the internet. But what makes these so unsettling is that they could be true. These aren't just campfire tales. They're about moments where the ordinary world seemed to glitch, revealing something horrible underneath. We're talking about everything from strange, unexplainable encounters to terrifyingly close calls with the kind of monsters that are all too human. These are the stories that make you double-check the locks on your doors and maybe even glance over your shoulder in your own empty house. So, get comfortable, and let's begin. Section 1, The Man in the Attic. Our first story is a chilling example of a fear that I think everyone has, that you aren't actually alone in your own home. The user who posted it learned that the most terrifying threats can come from inside the one place you're supposed to be safe. It all started with little things. A noise from the kitchen that she just wrote off as the house settling. A shadow at the edge of her vision that she blamed on being tired. She lived alone in a 2-story house and was used to its little quirks. But then came that undeniable feeling of being watched. It was that cold prickle on the back of her neck while doing dishes. That sudden urge to look over her shoulder while watching TV. She kept telling herself she was just being paranoid. One night, she was woken up by a very distinct creak from the hallway. She froze, listening hard in the dead silence. Nothing. She convinced herself it was just her imagination, but she still got up, her heart pounding, and checked all the locks. Everything was secure. Still, she barely slept that night. A few nights later, it happened again. Only this time, it wasn't a creak. It was breathing. It was faint, but it was definitely inside her room. Shaking, she grabbed her phone, the screen lighting up her face. She switched on the flashlight, cutting a beam through the darkness. She scanned the room, the empty chair, the dresser, the closed closet door. The room was empty. That feeling of being watched became constant. She started losing sleep, jumping at every little sound. Then, one afternoon, she got home from work and found her back door was slightly ajar. She always locked it. Her blood ran cold. She called the police before she even dared to step inside. They came and cleared the house, room by room. But nothing was stolen, and nothing was out of place. An officer suggested the lock might be faulty, that maybe she'd just forgotten to secure it properly. She wanted to believe him, but she knew better. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was there. She was in her bedroom trying to read when she heard a soft noise from right above her. It came from the attic. It sounded like a quiet shuffle. That was all it took. She called the police again, feeling like an idiot, but unable to ignore the gut feeling that someone was up there. When the officers arrived, one of them pulled down the attic ladder in her hallway closet and climbed up. She heard him mutter something. Then, his voice tight, he called down, "Ma'am, stay where you are. There's someone up here." It turned out a man had been living in her attic for weeks. He'd found a loose vent on the roof and had been sneaking down at night to get food and water from her kitchen. The police found a little nest he'd made, a sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and a small collection of her things. Little things she'd never even noticed were missing. A photograph, a book, a coffee mug. The most terrifying part? The police figured he was probably watching her sleep every single night, just a few feet above her head. He was a ghost in her own home. They caught him, but she wrote that the feeling of being truly alone and safe in her house is something she'll probably never get back. He wasn't a spirit, he was a real person, and he had been living in her attic. Section 2. My wife has been peeking at me. Sometimes the horror doesn't break in from the outside. Sometimes it comes from the person you trust the most. This next story is a bit different. It's an adaptation from a famous post on R Na Sleep, which, if you don't know, is a subreddit for horror fiction. The rule is that everything is treated as true, and some stories are so convincing they feel like real-life accounts. This one is a perfect example. The poster, let's call him Tom, had been with his wife, Lynn, for 6 years. Their life was normal, happy. She was the most down-to-earth person he knew, which made her new habit so incredibly unsettling. It started small. One morning, he was rushing for work when he saw her out of the corner of his eye, peeking at him from around the hallway corner. Just her eyes and a little bit of her hair. When he called her name, she just vanished. He laughed it off and called her a weirdo as he left for the day. But it kept happening. He'd be on the couch and get that familiar prickle of being watched. He'd look up and see her peeking from behind a bookshelf. Or he'd be in his study, and her face would appear in the crack of the door for just a second. He figured it was just some weird new game she was playing. When he finally asked her about it, she just smiled and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." Her answer gave him a genuine chill. Was she joking? The paranoia started to creep in. He found himself constantly checking over his shoulder, feeling jumpy in his own home. And then the game changed. One evening, he was in the shower. As he was rinsing shampoo from his hair, he felt it again, that intense feeling of being watched. He slowly opened his eyes, and his heart just about stopped. Lynn was peeking from behind the shower curtain. Her head was craned into the shower, hair sopping wet, but the rest of her body was still on the other side of the curtain. Her eyes were wide, and her mouth was stretched into this terrible, happy grin. He screamed and fell back against the tile. She didn't move. She just stared at him with that unhinged smile, her makeup running down her face. That was the moment he knew this wasn't a game. He fled the house that night, his mind reeling. Who was this person? What happened to his wife? The story posted on Reddit ends right there, leaving the husband and anyone who reads it completely terrified. It's fiction, but it taps into a real fear. What happens when the person you love most becomes a stranger? If you're enjoying these stories and want to hear more tailies that blur the line between what's real and what isn't, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. It helps us out and makes sure you won't miss what we've got coming up next. Section 3. The night shift hospitals are places of healing, but they're also places of life and death. After the sun goes down and the halls go quiet, they can feel like a totally different world. This story comes from a nurse who worked the night shift in a very old hospital, one that was first built back in World War II. As a nurse, you get used to strange things, especially on the night shift when the rest of the world is asleep. You almost have to be a skeptic to get through it. But some things just can't be explained away. One night, there was an elderly patient who had been admitted for a simple infection. She was completely lucid, with no history of dementia or anything like it. Around 3 a.m., the deadest hour of the night, a blood-curdling scream came from her room. The nurse and her colleague rushed in and found the woman sitting bolt upright in bed, her eyes wide with terror, pointing a trembling finger at the foot of her bed. She was hysterical, screaming about a man with a bag over his head who was just standing there watching her. They tried to soothe her, telling her no one was there, that it must have been a bad dream. But even as the nurse said the words, the air in the room felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. After they finally calmed the patient down, she and her colleagues stepped back out into the dim hallway. As they were turning away from the door, they both saw it at the same time. At the far end of the hall, a shadowy figure passed right through a set of fire doors. It didn't walk. It glided, just a flicker of movement, and then it was gone. Now, those doors are always locked at night. You need a key card to open them. For someone to unlock them, walk through, and lock them again would have made a noise. This was silent and instant. They just stood there, looking at each other, sharing the same unspoken thought. They hadn't been alone in that hallway. They walked back to the nurse's station, both of them seriously unnerved. These were experienced nurses, used to the pressures of hospital life. But what they saw wasn't a trick of the light, or their tired minds playing tricks on them. That hospital is full of stories, passed down from one generation of nurses to the next. But that night, they added their own chapter. Conclusion. So, are these stories real? The truth is, we'll never know for sure. They were shared by regular people on Reddit, users who needed to tell someone about a moment that shattered their sense of safety. A man hiding just feet away, a loved one turning into a terrifying stranger, a shadow in a hospital where no one should be. What makes them so powerful is that they tap into fears we all have. They remind us that horror isn't always about made-up monsters. Sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that feel like they could really happen. They're whispers from the modern world that suggest our reality is a lot more fragile and a lot scarier than we like to think. If you have a true scary story of your own, we'd love to hear it. Share it in the comments below. We actually do read them. Now, sleep well.